Welcome to Everyday Entrepreneurs Everywhere with your host, Chris Parker.
And welcome to Everyday Entrepreneur Everywhere. This is Chris Parker, and I am having a conversation with Art Bell, who has recently published a book around constant comedy, and it is How I Started Comedy Central and Lost My Sense of Humor. And even in saying that sort of makes me want to laugh. So how I started Comedy Central, which is in itself, oh my God, let's hear about that. And then how you lost your sense of humor. I'm sure we're going to unpack that as well as many other things. So Art Bell, thank you for joining. What I'd love to hear is, what is it that you do and why do you do what you do?
Well, that's a good question to start with. First, thank you for having me, Chris. It's really a pleasure to be here. What is it that I do right now is I'm writing. This is the 17th iteration of whatever it is we call a career. And I find that I really enjoy writing. I wrote the book, which is a memoir, which was a very personal undertaking, because I found that with memoir, it really is important to turn yourself inside out to give people an understanding of what you're thinking. So that's been a really interesting undertaking. And I'm writing fiction as well. I've gotten a few short stories published. Hopefully we'll end up with a novel someday. We can dream. But I really find that I enjoy writing.
And what is it? I guess for me, I'm going to, the why behind the why is it the act of writing, or is it the act of sharing, or the creative part, or what, because writing can be hard for a lot of people. I'm just curious.
I think writing is hard for everybody. I don't think anybody sits down and, has a field day with it. Dorothy Parker famously said, I hate writing. I love having written. And that sums up a lot of the feeling. I will say that, although I'm not totally in touch with her, I hate writing, because if I can get into the zone and, really get out 1,000 words at a sitting and then read it and laugh or cry or say, yeah, that's pretty good. That's kind of a thrill when that happens. And hey, we're in this for the thrills, right? So I find that is what I enjoy about it. Plus, one thing I found out about writing that I didn't know is that writing is like driving at night. You can only see as far as your headlights will take you. And that's the fun part. You don't plan everything you're going to write. You sit down and you start, and you have a handful of characters, or more importantly, a character. In the case of my memoir, it was me. In the case of the fiction I write, you start out with sort of an idea, and then you see where it goes. And I'm always amazed to hear a writer say, yeah, I was writing that, and then I just realized that my character would never have done that, would never have, committed that crime or whatever it is. And I used to wonder at that, like, seriously, come on, it's your thing. No, your characters actually do direct you, and the story does direct you when you're writing.
With Constant Comedy, it's a memoir about Comedy Central, and you shared before we started recording that this is the 30th anniversary this month. Is that were you really compelled to tell the origin story? Was that the reason for this, or is it to go back and relive that? I'm curious, how did you, I guess, start that project and say, yeah, this is a great thing to do?
Okay, I'm going to tell you how I started it. It may surprise you. I never set out to write anything about Comedy Central or my career. I did set out to write memoir, and I took some classes at Sarah Lawrence Writing Institute, which is a good place to take writing classes, because I wanted to learn how to write. It's not like I hadn't written anything my whole life, but like anything else, if you take lessons, you get better faster. So I did learn how to write, and I did learn a lot about memoir, and I was mostly writing stories about my childhood. Then one day I came in, and I had written a story about something funny that happened to me while I was at Comedy Central. And everybody in the class kind of looked up and said, wow, that's kind of cool. We didn't know you worked there, which was a little frustrating for me because I had just written 150,000 words about my childhood, which didn't get that kind of response. I mean, I'm kidding a little bit. Everybody was very gracious, and I did write some good stuff. But, they said, why don't you write some more about Comedy Central? And I said, all right. So I tried to do some other stories I had. And then I realized, wow, this was the greatest adventure of my career. And I just kept writing. And eventually I got to the point where I really had told the story, and it did have me as the main character. And there was a story arc, and there were antagonists, and there were things that got in my way, and that I had difficulties to surmount. And I realized that it was reading like a novel, which is what I hoped, and had a lot of dialogue in it, recreated meetings and stuff like that. And it was funny. So there it was. And I will admit, I had to do a lot of work after I got it written to actually turn it into a good book. But I was very proud of that effort,
And I have to read the book. So for the listening audience,
yes, you do.
And
so does everyone in your audience.
And so does everyone in the audience. And if you go to ebullient.com/podcast/art-bell, the Amazon link is there, as well as the link to his website. And he also has a podcast that was launched today, on the day of this recording. So there's a lot of stuff out there that you can discover about art. Was the journey of Comedy Central, and Comedy Central, if I understand right, was sort of the amalgamation of two channels competing. Was that in itself a funny journey, or is that all just corporate BS? Like I can imagine that if they're producing comedy, maybe the suits behind it are less full of comedy, or was actually the whole thing a fun experience?
Let's leave it at the whole thing was a fun experience. However,
okay,
it was also very difficult and very serious. Listen, you're in the comedy business, you're laughing because people there I found were like me. They loved comedy. They loved to laugh. I was working with comedians and professionals in the comedy business. That said, it was a little bit of an insular group, the comedy business, when I got to it. I was not in the comedy business when I pitched HBO on the idea of an all comedy channel. And I was teamed up with a guy named Stu Smiley, who was the head of comedy programming at HBO. And the first thing he said to me is, what do you know about comedy? And he didn't say it in a nice way, like, I'm here to help. He said it like, who the hell are you? And what am I working with you for? And I talk a lot about that in the book, how I had to kind of figure it out myself to a certain extent, and how I got a hard time from a lot of people in the comedy business at the beginning because they didn't know where I came from or what I was doing. And on top of that, when we launched the channel, we launched as the Comedy Channel at HBO. Our competition came later. The channel wasn't an instant success. As a matter of fact, it was an instant failure. We were lambasted by the press after we launched as it's not funny. How could HBO do this? It's a flop. They really had a good time taking us apart. But, looking back on it, anytime you say, hey, we are going to launch the funniest channel ever, the chances of that happening on day one or even the first month or even the first year are slim to none. And the press was just into their schadenfreude mode. They just wanted to enjoy the failure of HBO, which at that point was the Netflix of television. I know that's an odd thing to say, but they were the hottest thing in television when we launched the Comedy Channel. So I wanted to convey the fact that comedy was not shot out of a cannon, fully formed and successful as Comedy Central. It took a long time and a lot of people to get it to be successful.
Why the perseverance? I mean, like what happened to keep it alive? Because there must have been 1,000 opportunities for the plug to get pulled, but somebody somewhere believed in it, or what was the fuel that kept it going?
Well, you mentioned the fact that we were, it was a corporate environment. And yeah, there were suits and there were people looking at the bottom line and trying to figure out whether we were successful or going to be successful from a business standpoint. And then there was the other side, which was the comedy community, which was looking to see if this was something that was actually going to work and celebrate comedy, which was my intention when I pitched it. But I will say I went to work every day after we launched for the first year, wondering if this was the day they were going to pull the plug, because it was, as I said, not successful. I went to work every day trying to figure out, okay, what can we do less of that's not working? And what can we do more of that is working? And that was what kept me going. Of course, I felt it as a personal responsibility at that point to make it successful, even though I was, working with lots of other people and I wasn't even the boss. I was a junior executive, but I felt a personal responsibility to make it work. And I felt the responsibility not only to my bosses at HBO and Time Inc., who were watching carefully, but also to the hundreds of people who were now depending on this for their livelihood. Because if the channel went down, then a lot of people would be out of a job. So it was not only my conviction that there would be a comedy network in the world and other people's conviction at that point. It was also it was not fear so much, but the possibility of failure is a motivator. It keeps you going. It keeps you coming in saying, don't give up, keep this thing going. Anything can happen. Let's make it work. And that's what I did.
And in my research, there were some serendipitous moments. I heard on another conversation you were talking about MST3K and how that sort of happened, and that is just joyful, because in my youth, that was something that I wish now I could share with my boys in that same environment of sitting there, with the dudes, in high school, watching Mystery Science Theater, and just getting into that. So how did, can you share that story on how MST3K, arrived at?
Yeah, it's actually an interesting story. We had a head writer at Comedy Channel. His name is Eddie Gordetsky. He's still writing. He's a very funny guy. And he came in one day and he said, look, he kind of talked funny. He said, hey, we have to have a show where comedians are sitting there making fun of movies and television and bad stuff. He says, because that's what comedians like to do. I said, okay. And we all said, okay. And we started thinking about developing that show. And as luck would have it, we got an envelope in the mail. And in the envelope was a letter that said, hey, we hear you guys are starting a comedy channel. Is this something that would interest you? And we shoved the tape in the player, and it was Mystery Science Theater 3000, much to our surprise and delight. These guys had been making it at a UHF channel in Minneapolis just for fun. And they thought maybe it would work for us. And we got on a plane the next day, made a deal, and the rest is history. I mean, Mystery Science Theater really was our first hit. It was kind of a cult hit because we didn't have a lot of audience. But it was one of the things, you ask what keeps you going in the face of adversity. I remember saying to the president of our channel at that time, who I was reporting to, when he said, oh my gosh, we got to go to a cable convention and we're a failure, we're a flop. What are we going to do? I said, hey, hold it. We have Mystery Science Theater 3000. We're going to make the entire presentation, the entire booth, all about our big hit, Mystery Science Theater 3000. And that got us through some really hard times. And as I said, the rest is history. That show is still alive today. I'm interested. You said you can't share it with your kids. Why is that? How old are your kids?
Well, they're 10 and 12. Well, I mean, share it in, maybe that was the nostalgia in me, and sitting in around the living room on this big old grungy TV, cable box, that whole thing. I'm sure it's findable out there.
Findable. It's all over the place. Actually, Netflix just relaunched it.
What?
Yeah, okay. They had 12 episodes with Joel Hodgson. I say just, it may have been a year ago already because, in my mind, just is anything that's in the last 10 years. And I will also say that the guys who did Mystery Science Theater 3000 have been doing something called riff tracks, where they are basically doing that with current movies, doing what they did, making remarks without the visuals, and they have you sync it up to the movie. So I can't tell you how funny it is to watch Twilight. Actually, they did the Twilight movies, which I don't know if you've seen them, but they can be funny all by themselves. But anyway, watching these guys take apart Twilight in real time is a delight. So look for riff tracks. You can find that, and also look for Mystery Science Theater 3000. The old ones are not hard to find. There's still a huge fan base, and there are new ones. So I would get your boys hooked on that. My kids loved it and still love it. They still love it.
Something I'm doing with some of my friends from back in that time, we have started reflecting on what are these sort of cultural, very meaningful cultural things that just struck a chord and still strike a chord in us now. We want to share with our children. And so we're consolidating this and going out to start, collect all of these things. So I haven't heard of the riff racks before, but I'll research that and I will go get that. But
that's just the ultimate iteration of what they started.
No, cool. Well, like it does spark a thought, like Dark Side of Oz. If you're, that whole thing where it's you play Wizard of Oz and Dark Side of the Moon at the same time, and it's sort of the soundtrack.
I've heard of it.
Sort of syncing up with it. So, question. I want to go back to that luck. As luck would have it, the envelope showed up. As I have shared with you, I am an indie film producer. And is this industry all about luck, or luck in relationships? Is it?
No, no, it isn't. I mean, you can't say that. And let me just point out that you make your own luck. I mean, one way or another, that show was going to show up. We were looking for it essentially, and if we didn't find it, we were going to make it. It may not have been Mystery Science Theater 3000, and that would have been not as good maybe, but there it was. Secondly, when I pitched the Comedy Channel to HBO, one of the things I said, look, this thing is going to end up being the center of the comedy universe. And ultimately projects will find us, comedians will find us, comedy writers will find us. We will be, if we are doing our job, the place for innovative comedy. And at some point we won't have to look for it anymore. It'll find us. And that's Mystery Science Theater 3000, I think, is the first instance of that. Now, that was before we launched. I will also point out that comedians and comedy writers found us pretty quickly too, partly because they thought that it was very flattering that someone was throwing a channel for them, the way people had thrown a channel for the rock and roll industry and the sports business and everything else. That was tremendously helpful. My point is, you make your own luck. I mean, if we hadn't started the channel, then maybe things would have gone a lot differently. Were we lucky? I think we were hardworking, and I think luck plays a part in everything. Meaning, you run into somebody, you can't discount the fact that you get lucky, but you have to play to win. Is my phrase. You can be a shy retiring type, or you can be bold and take chances. The difference is the shy retiring types will keep their job for 30 years. The bold and take chances may not, but they might have a more interesting life. So I often point that out. Knowing people, I'm often asked who my mentor was or who I connected with. I always say, look, I try to connect with everybody in some way or other. Was there a mentor? There were certainly people who taught me stuff. There was no one person who shepherded me through the industry as their project. You got to meet this guy. He's great. Art Bell. That didn't happen. And I wasn't that type of guy anyway. I did a good job of just keeping my eyes open, making sure I was taking advantage of opportunities and persevering. Persisting in the face of a lot of odds against succeeding.
Perseverance, and also with others. And you shared the podcast, that your own podcast that is out now, that the I guess the mission or the first series of that is to go back to some of that original band of brothers or brothers and sisters, from the origin of Comedy Central. Is that going to be one of the main themes there about how you persevered together? Or what are you hoping to discover from these probably incredible people who you achieved this thing with?
Well, what we are discovering, and we've done a number of tapings, they've just been more fun than we even imagined. First of all, visiting with people you worked with 30 years ago is a riot. There's a couple of things going on. One, that time we were young. We were all young, as you can imagine, and it was an explosion of creativity. Many of these people had their first real jobs in television, including Jon Stewart, by the way, who was the host of a show we started called Short Attention Span Theater. He was there at the very beginning, and we saw him on television and knew he was going to be good. But you gotta think about the fact that people like him. We gave Bill Maher his show, Politically Incorrect. We started him in 1992. And some of the people we're talking about, not only talking about the time and what it was like and what are the stories, many of which I share in my book, but so many of the people we've spoken to told stories about me that I didn't know, because they were sort of in a different place in the building or a different location. And, I was kind of like more of a suit, although I was in programming. But to hear from the talent talk about what was going on and what they were seeing has just been a riot. The other thing is that these people have been incredibly successful. I mean, we spoke to Gail Berman, who had been a Broadway producer. She got her first job in television at the Comedy Channel. She didn't know a thing about television. And her story about what she was thinking as she's kind of trying to figure everything out, producing stuff at Comedy Channel, it's a riot. Second of all, she went on to become the head of Paramount Pictures. She was also the head of Fox Broadcasting. And she also produced some of the most memorable shows in the world, including Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And this is a person who is legendary now in the entertainment business and a great guest. Let me tell you, she is so much fun to talk about. And I think we were like hanging out together as kids, basically trying to put on a show, put on Comedy Channel. So it's not only her, it's other people like her, and what they've gone on to do is breathtaking.
Well, it sounds like there was a sort of this perfect storm of talent and creativity and a need in the market. But where did the need in the market come from? So like a 24-hour comedy channel that probably wasn't obvious at the time, but was that your idea or where did that come from?
Yeah, that was my idea. Although, as an idea, it doesn't sound like much. My idea was embellished by a programming plan so that you can get into the business fairly inexpensively. And in those days, remember, you couldn't get into the broadcasting or cable business without a lot of infrastructure, satellite dishes. There was no digital then. You couldn't put a channel out from a garage the way you can now. And so I needed a company like HBO behind the whole thing. But interestingly enough, when I pitched my idea, even though I had really thought a lot about it, what it should be, how it should be programmed, I had a vision for it. I had a lot of passion for comedy because I always loved comedy, even though I wasn't in the comedy business. It was pretty quickly rejected a lot of times as a bad idea. As a matter of fact, the first time I pitched the head of HBO programming on the idea, she said, "That is the worst idea I have ever heard. And let me tell you why." And then she went on to say, "Look, decent comedians are not going to be on that channel. You're not going to get them. And, nobody wants 24 hours of comedy. And there's enough comedy on the dial today, on television today. And, why would HBO risk their reputation? Why would anyone risk their reputation trying to pull that off? It's too hard." That was why I think one of the reasons the Comedy Network had never got started. I had been thinking about it for years. I woke up every morning expecting to read Variety, and the headline would be "So-and-so starts a comedy network," because, like, you're kidding me, right? Sports Network, ESPN, MTV for rock and roll, and there was an all news channel. I mean, this wasn't a huge leap, but I was told it was hard to do, and people couldn't figure it out, and it was expensive, and nobody's going to do it. So we did it.
So coming back to that perseverance or basically just cojones, so the head of HBO says that's a stupid idea. And apparently that doesn't faze you. Did you have a night of stiff drinks to get over that or something? Or how did you, because like, my God, that must have been brutal.
I walked out of there having had a truck full of cold water poured on the idea, and me, by the way. She wasn't exactly saying hang in there anyway. I went back to my office, and by the time I got back to my office, I thought, well, she's wrong. Somebody is going to start a comedy network. Maybe it's not me. Maybe it's not HBO. Maybe it's not going to happen for a while, but somebody's going to do it. It's just an obvious thing to do because I love comedy, and I know there are other people who love comedy. And when you say comedy, it wasn't just stand-up comedy. It was all comedy movies, comedy sitcoms. I studied this stuff. I heard all the records. I loved all that stuff, including the old stuff, the silence. There had to be a channel that celebrated it eventually. And that's why I wasn't put off. And that's why I went back to my office and kept working on the idea.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions. One question is probably pretty politically incorrect. So if you don't want to answer it, then fire it back. But I have had a comedian on the podcast, American guy who also lives here in Amsterdam, who makes fun of politicians a lot. And when he was on, I asked him the question is, in the current world of politics, where it's almost to the level of comedy in certain ways itself, how does comedy make fun of politics when politics is so disastrously comedic in itself? Do you have any reflection on, I guess, the current culture around what is comedy and not? And then how does that help us as society? And this is a completely off-topic question, I guess, but it's for me, you've studied it. Comedy for me is a frightening thing as a creator because it's such an art form and the timing is required. And, so actually making a comedy film is just frightening for me because it's such another level. So I have that sort of distance from it. And then I'm also watching, it's like comedy can be a healing thing, and that people are saying things that would be normally unacceptable to say. And that's a very societally beneficial thing. But with the state of politics now, it doesn't seem funny anymore. I don't know. What's your thought about that? Well,
one of the things that I came to early in high school was satire. And satire is being funny or comedy in the service of making an important point about something that is not going the way you want it to go. And, I studied Swift and A Modest Proposal and how that made a huge difference. Now, I don't think there was anything funny about the Irish, the potato famine at the time, as there's not anything funny about so much about what's going on in our lives, Black Lives Matter and Me Too. But think about Me Too. Let's take that as an example. I think women comedians have had a big role in bringing the women's experience in America to an audience in a way that is much more palatable than an essay or an accusation. And I don't think I have to do much convincing to point out that is a way we learn about what it's like to be a woman without actually having to sit through a lecture, And if you don't think that's an important contribution, I think you're wrong. Same thing with Black Lives Matter. I saw Richard Pryor on the Ed Sullivan Show when I was a kid. And he was talking about the Black experience in Peoria, Illinois as a kid. And I was laughing like crazy. And when I stopped laughing, I thought, wow, he's had a tough life. And he's talking about it. And he's talking about what's wrong with that. But he didn't do it in a way that put me off or presumably anybody else. If we don't have that in our lives, if we don't have comedians sending us messages, giving us their insights covered in comedy, making us laugh at the same time and forcing us to look through their eyes, through their prism at the world, then we've lost something very, very important. Because I don't want to go on reading essays about politics for the rest of my life. I don't know about you.
Well, one of my sources, I'm not sure if I should be proud of this, but it's true. It's one of my sources of political information is The Daily Show. And it's wrapped in comedy sometimes. And it's an approachable thing. So yeah, it's comedy can really make you think. And that's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Listen, there are areas of comedy that people think of as areas that comedy shouldn't go. I will point out that death is a big subject of comedy. It's a big subject of humanity. It's part of the experience. We're in the middle of a pandemic where death is even less funny now because people are dying so needlessly. But, National Lampoon, one of the all-time great comedy institutions in America, which is no longer around in the form that it was in, they did a death issue that is still cited and as one of the great comedic undertakings. It was a magazine, and it was all about death, and it was all so funny. Death is a tough subject, but you end up laughing about it when you have to, because otherwise you'll cry.
Yeah, and it makes it real, makes it approachable. So, Art, last question. Based on your book, how I started Comedy Central and lost my sense of humor. The title of the book is Constant Comedy. Have you found your sense of humor again?
Yes. Let me tell you where this subtitle comes from. Constant Comedy, how I started Comedy Central and lost my sense of humor. Constant comedy is, of course, the fact that when you're doing a 24-hour television channel, you're constantly shoving comedy into it and looking for new stuff. How I started Comedy Central and lost my sense of humor really came from something that my boss, Michael Fuchs, the chairman of HBO, said 3 or 4 months after we launched. He called me in. The channel was a disaster. It was failing. I expected them to pull the plug any minute. And he said to me, Art, it took a comedy channel to get me to lose my sense of humor. And I wasn't laughing, and he wasn't laughing, and nobody was laughing. It was serious. He was embarrassed by it. And it looked like it was going to be a failure. I wanted to convey that in the title, that this was not easy, that Comedy Central, that everybody loves now, it's the 30th anniversary, was not shot out of a cannon, fully formed and completely successful, that it took a lot of work, and it almost didn't make it. I
think, that's probably a timeless story, that the sort of the overnight success took years and years and years and years to perfect and discover. So, and that's all in the book, Constant Comedy. And there is also a podcast out of the same title.
Yeah. The Constant Comedy Podcast with Art Bell and Vinny Favale. Vinny was my compatriot at the beginning of Comedy Channel at HBO, and then went on to Comedy Central. We had a lot of fun together, and as I said, an explosion of creativity. And he went on to be CBS development executive in charge of Late Night with David Letterman, and just one of the greats in the comedy business, with a great perspective on the comedy business. So doing it with him is an honor and a delight.
It sounds just joyful. And also going back to, like, as you said, as kids in your new first job, forming yourself, your professional self. And some people, sounds like many of these people have gone on to even bigger and greater things. So beautiful. So
I think people who listen to the podcast will be really surprised and delighted that all those people came out of Comedy Channel, Comedy Central. Amazing.
Love it. I will catch up to that, because I noticed there's 2 episodes out already. So more to come.
Yep.
And if people are interested in discovering more about you, it is at artbellwriter.com.
Correct.
And I see you're also on LinkedIn and other socials. But the best place to start is Constant Comedy, the book, or the podcast. So, Art,
thanks very
so much. Thanks so much for joining. It's
been fun, Chris. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Like and subscribe to the podcast on your favorite player, and download the Simplicity Kit from ebullient.com.